So I've just seen the last 2 episodes of Uzumaki, and since then, since it's finished, a lot of people have started releasing their videos finally on Uzumaki, and a lot of them in a negative light, surprisingly. I want to sit here and maybe be the first to say I know episode 2 was very, very bad and just a complete miss in general. But episodes 3 and 4, especially 4, were really good and back on par with episode 1, especially 4. Let's talk about it. Is it weird that episode 2 is the episode that made a lot of people come out of this experience negatively? No, not at all. If I didn't like finishing shows and just didn't have a general curiosity of how they would salvage episodes 3 and 4, I probably would have tried to death episode 2 as well because it was genuinely that bad, especially with the animation and pacing.
Scaring people is just what I do!
On both of those fronts by default, episodes 3 and 4 are just better. Episode 3 looked good by just being a better version of what episode 2 tried to be. There weren't any glaring animation blunders like in the previous episode, that there was a very much so a lack of 3D animated portions within these 2 episodes, which by default made them feel better than episode 2. And episode 4 looked even better by comparison, with the style more similar to episode 1 I want to say, especially with the character designs and the way they moved. People's hair had highlights, it didn't seem stiff, it looked a lot better than episode 3 even. I'd personally say that this was the best it looked since episode 1. Even with their pacing, it's just better than with episode 2 and them trying to cram 5 chapters with 5 different stories within it. Episode 3 covered the last 3 chapters of Volume 2, and Episode 4 covered the entirety of Volume 3, which were like 7 chapters, but with it being more connected than the rest of the volumes, I think it flowed a lot better together. It's starting to get a little wacky. I'm gonna say it here first, it's starting to get a little wacky. But let's sit here again and try to discuss the literal and figurative meanings behind the spirals. The first thing I want to point at is Shuichi's family and the spiral into insanity that both of them endured throughout the series. It started in episode 1 with the father, but his ethereal presence has stained the minds of both his wife and son Shuichi. His obsession with spirals basically surviving past his death, which was symbolized by the smoke literally forming into a spiral after they burned his body. His wife, ever since, cannot stand the sight of spirals and wants nothing to do with them. While she's been in the hospital, she's cut off the tips of her fingers and toes just so she can't see those spiral patterns anymore. But something that Shuichi just found out in this episode was that there's an organ in your ear that's basically a spiral, and him and the doctor try to keep it away from her attention. To no avail. Whether it's just in her head or is actually the father's obsession haunting her, she has come to the realization that there is a spiral in her ear, and she goes insane and jams a sharp object in there, basically causing her death. And her being also forms a spiral in the sky once burnt. At this point, we can see a switch in Shuichi's mental, where before then he was terrified and even combative against the spirals, even trying to run away all the way back in episode 1. But now with both of his parents passed, it's like he spiraled so much to the point where he's basically given up, with the only reason he's still a little bit sane is because he wants Kyrie to survive. It's no longer an obsession for him. He's basically accepted the spiral's inevitable takeover. It's super fun trying to figure out what spirals mean for a lot of these people, but most of the time it just boils down to somebody spiraling out into some form of emotion. The downward spiral into insanity. We see that with the mosquitoes in episode 3 as well, where they're spiraling all over town, and normally, they say in the show at least, this means it's mating season for them, but they're biting all over the women. And all the women end up in the hospital and pregnant, but they also have this taste, this thirst for blood for some reason, like they are mosquitoes, wanting to feed their youth. Then it gets even weirder when they do have their children, and the children are yearning to go back into the womb. So much so that they somehow are growing placenta, and the doctors are cutting them off and feeding it to the other patients? What? This is insane, it's so mad. It's disturbing to even think about or even try to come up with some sort of silly symbolic reasoning behind it. If I had to think of anything, I'd akin it to Shuichi's form of spiral, where there is just that innate connection between parent and child, just in this form, instead of being obsessed with spirals per se, They're obsessed with blood and reforming that spiral connection within the womb. Trying to make sense of that was one thing, but episode 4 in its entirety and the ending is a whole different ballgame. To start things off, episode 3 ends with the storm, which is a giant eye in the sky yearning for Kyrie to approach it. So it sends out tornadoes after her and tore down houses, all in hopes of getting her attention, I guess. Shuichi tried to take her underground, but the spirals in the water there merged with the storm to form a big pond in the middle of the city. So that pond is a literal spiral that also sends out spirals now. And any harsh movement or quick breath can create these spiral tornadoes at will almost. So everyone has gone into hiding because of it. And that's where episode 4 comes in, where I feel like all of the symbolism of what the spirals could be, any hidden meanings behind the spirals, are completely thrown out the window now. Now we're just here with the physical. Everyone's getting swept away into tornadoes, everybody's turning into snails or a jumbled up mess in the houses. People that go there cannot find their way out of the town. The town also seems like it's turned into a spiral of its own. Clocks and the concept of time has seemed to spiral out of control, and it all comes to a boiling point where the houses are done. To not go out in the storm, people have been expanding the houses out to form multiple spirals around the pond. And Shuichi gives a bold prediction that the way the houses are structured now might be its original form, but due to time passing and it eventually being turned into a town like it was at the start of the show, the spiral epidemic is now occurring because it wants to return to the way it was. Like the town itself is alive and spiraling out into something, but it just keeps getting weirder than that. On the search for her parents who got swept away by a couple of tornadoes, Kyrie goes to the middle of town where the pond is, and there are steps there, and those steps lead to this altar-like area where there are so many unique spiral art pieces that they are producing this blinding light, and that's kinda where the show ends. It's this weird ethereal being of spirals that's just there. Our main characters give up and tangle themselves together like we've seen previously and become a spiral themselves, and we get a glimpse into the town a lot of years later where it seems like it's looped back around to the first episode, just with new people this time. Truly, this town's lifespan itself is a spiral and an endless cycle of resetting and aging. That is insane. You can really tell this was made during the pandemic because not one episode is animated the same. It's very inconsistent and all over the place, which is weird. And I would have said, hey, maybe it fit the vibe of Uzumaki, but episode 2 was just done so poorly that I can't even imagine myself to say, hey, maybe it was done this way on purpose, because it clearly wasn't done this way on purpose. But I do think they were able to establish themselves together something pretty good. Outside of episode 2, I do think 1, 3, and 4 are decent to good episodes, so I would say go out of your way to watch it. Just be on the lookout for episode 2 and how bad it is, but that's basically it. What are your opinions of Uzumaki as a whole in the comments down below? Let me know and I'll get back to you guys as soon as I can. Goodbye.
So fight and fight.